Thank you all for joining in. My name is Amrit, and welcome to this new episode of Xobin Talks. Today, I have with me Daniela Herrera, and it's really a pleasure and honor to have you on our show. Daniela is an award-winning DE&I professional. She's got 17 years of experience in areas like talent operation, in recruitment, and in people management. She's been featured on platforms like Forbes, Business Insider. In her professional experience, Daniela has helped her companies identify, deconstruct, and rebuild inclusion practices to help make organizations a better place to work. Daniela, thank you for being on Zobin, and it's great to have you here.
Of course, thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really excited about this conversation.
I want to get started by asking you, how did you get into this profession? How did you come into being a D&I professional?
I love that question because the short answer is I don't know. And the long answer is I think that I've always been very interested and attracted towards diversity, equity, and inclusion, even before I knew that that was a thing. So I was born and raised in Buenos Aires in Argentina. And when it was just first started in my career, 17 years ago, diversity, equity, and inclusion did not exist. I'm not gonna lie. And it's still now 17 years after, my country's just getting started with those conversations. But even when I was doing recruitment, I was already, doing what we now know as diversity recruiting 17 years ago. And I was always pushing for more inclusive and accessible practices. But again, I didn't know that that was what I was doing. And then 7 years ago, when I had the opportunity and the privilege to transfer to New York, that's when I learned that what I was doing actually had a completely different name. It was a completely different career. So that's when I actually fully started working on ED&I.
That's great. One of the major questions that people have about diversity and inclusion is there's so much of fluidity in the nomenclature. Some people call it diversity and inclusion. Some people call it diversity, equity, and inclusion. Of late, someone told me it's representation and belonging. You really don't you don't know where do you call it. The nomenclature is very confusing. So could you shed more light on that? What exactly is this?
Yeah, sure. Honestly, I don't know. So this, every single ED&I professional that you talk to, they're going to give you a completely different answer. And there is a reason behind it, right? There are some professionals that will focus a little bit more on the diversity piece. Other professionals or companies will want to focus a little bit more on equity or inclusion or belonging. And that's how they name their teams or their disciplines. Unfortunately, there is no one way to call it. Every single company will call it or will name it differently. Personally, I like ED&I a little bit better. So equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the reason behind it is I strongly believe that we need to focus on equity first, making sure that we have equitable processes and systems and policies that will support talent. And then what's going to happen inherently is if your processes are equitable and they're inclusive, the diverse talent between a million air quotes will actually come to you, or it'll be easier for you to recruitment and to retain them, right? So that's my personal opinion. I also like that some companies are adding the J for justice into the name as well. I personally don't use it because I'm not well versed on justice. I'm not an attorney. I do not have a law degree. I do have some understanding, obviously, that comes from equity. But I do like companies that are actually putting a little bit more insight or effort into making their processes just as well.
That's interesting. Now, 93% of the leaders, the HR leaders that we spoke to, said that diversity, equity, and inclusion is their major focus. It's probably in their top 5 agenda. But when you speak to CXOs, leaders who are not necessarily part of the HR function, that number actually falls down to 33%. How
Yeah.
do you ensure that diversity, equity, and inclusion is not just an HR problem, but it's a company-wide problem? Because how do you tackle it if you don't consider it as a company-wide problem? So
Yeah.
what's your take on that? You've
I
consulted so
yeah.
many companies. So how do you tackle that?
I love this question, and I know that my answer is it's a little bit tricky, especially for people in HR. They don't necessarily agree with me most of the time, but I strongly believe that D&I or ED&I is not an HR issue. And the
Okay.
reason behind it is we know that HR policies and recruitment practices and processes and even promotion cycles and races, like the entire talent experience has been inequitable and inaccessible and uninclusive by design for way too long. So I am of the opinion that we cannot deconstruct something that is inequitable following the same systems and the same processes that we've been following for decades without even questioning, right? So what I mean with that is I do believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion should be a completely separate department, responding or reporting directly into the CXO or the CEO or whomever the business leader is. So in that way, it is easier, between a million or quotes, obviously, to embed diversity and inclusion into the company and every single system and policy and practice that we have in place. And at the same time, of course, we have a better way, if you may, of diversity, equity, and inclusion, collaborating very, very closely with HR and with recruitment, right? Because you do have an external, between millionaire quotes, an external professional that is not part of your own team that can come in, take a look at the processes that you've been following and the systems that you've been implementing, the platforms that you've been using, with a completely different set of eyes and a completely different set of experience and skills, and let you know, like, hey, you know what, like the way that we've been recruiting talent or promoting talent is inequitable or inaccessible or uninclusive because X, Y, and Z. And this is a better way or a more inclusive way to do it. So that's on the HR piece. How do we convince leaders? That is actually a tricky one, because again, every single company is at a completely different level on their ED&I journey. Some of them, some companies may not fully understand that actually having a more diverse workforce is even like way better for innovation and for creativity. And at the end of the day, like, it will bring more revenue or more clients or whatever it is that they're after. Some companies, unfortunately, are still set on the business case, which as of now is an outdated practice. But some of them are still on it, and they really want to see like all of the numbers and the data and, you know, the prospective data and where we'll be in the next five years. So there is no one size fits all type of solution on how to convince your business leader. I think as a D&I professional or as a consultant, what we do is we first try to understand where the company is, where the leader is, particularly what the blockers are, and we try to make them see and make them understand how diversity, equity, and inclusion will make their own company better and more successful at the end of the day.
Okay. So you're saying that DE&I should not be a function inside HR, but should
Correct.
probably report directly to the board or the CEO.
Exactly. Yeah. And if you push me, I would even say that even HR should actually report into diversity, equity, and inclusion, at least at the very beginning, right? Because again, we are talking about deconstructing some of those very outdated, like even in recruitment, or like, again, as we were talking about before, like hiring and promoting and retaining someone. So until we are sure that all of the systems are equitable, I would even suggest that maybe having HR report into diversity and inclusion for a little bit until like things are a little bit more equitable.
The fear today is that companies have started diversity and inclusion programs, but there is a counterclaim that these are mere lip services, right? You're not really doing something which is really moving the needle. I'll give you an instance. I think back in 2015, that was the first year when a lot of tech companies, they put out their data that this is our diversity statistics, and I was pretty sure that okay, these people have started tracking diversity related statistics. Maybe in a year or two, those numbers would improve. But we actually didn't see those numbers really improving. So now that you are a consultant and you help so many companies, what are the kind of activities that a company or an organization can do in any geography? What are the kind of activities that they can do which are not just mere lip service, like not just celebrating the Black History Month or the Pride Month, or just state that we have inclusive language for our job description? How do you go beyond these?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. And again, every single company will need to tackle this like differently, because again, they might be at a completely different stage. But from a general point of view, I mean, I do agree with you. Like a lot of companies are doing just performative actions. And I think that we see it a lot nowadays, especially after 2020, like especially here in the United States, like 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, like every single company was focused on hiring diverse talent and hiring Black talent, and hiring diversity and inclusion teams. And then fast forward to today, 3 years after, and then also focusing on working from home, because of course we were all in lockdown and the pandemic. And we also learned at that time that having the opportunity of working from home, it would actually open the door for so many talent that we were not even considering in the past, like talent with disabilities, neurodiverse talent, working parents, like talent that didn't have the privilege of working on a very expensive city just to be able to go to the office, right? And then fast forward 3 years after that, like every single company is kind of reversing back to 2019, both from a work from home situation and then from the diversity, equity, and inclusion point of view. We are now seeing a lot of companies that are either diminishing their diversity and inclusion teams, they're letting their teams go, or they're like pulling back on their budgets, or they're, for example, here in the United States, where the both the economic situation and the political situation are a little bit, tricky at the moment. So we are seeing a lot of companies like pulling back on, especially now in June, we are seeing companies pulling back on the LGBTQ Pride celebrations. So I agree with you that there are a lot of different companies that are doing just performative actions, right? Like they're jumping on just on the celebration part of diversity and inclusion. They're just like doing what you mentioned, like just focusing on hiring, right? Without focusing on building, again, equitable and accessible and inclusive processes. And I know that I've said that a couple of times already, so let me give you an example.
Sure.
So thinking about what I was saying just a couple of minutes ago about working from home and that giving the opportunity for so many talent that maybe just a couple of years ago we wouldn't have even considered for a role, right? So taking, for example, like talent with disabilities, we know that that's something that they appreciate, that they might need in some cases, or that they may just like prefer or want working from home. But what do we do with the rest of the process, right? Like, do we know if our hiring process is accessible? And with that, I mean, you mentioned before, making sure that our job descriptions are inclusive, right? That we are using inclusive language. That is a great start. But what do we mean exactly by inclusive language? Are we only focusing on gender inclusive language, or are we focusing on plain language, an inclusive language that is understood by every single person, no matter their background, their educational background, their cultural background, whether they speak English as a first language or not? That would be like writing job descriptions using plain language. Once we know that, do we know if our company website or our job application site, is it accessible? Mm-hmm. Can someone who's using a screen reader can actually access the information on your job description or your job application page? And then moving on to the screen, like the recruitment conversation, have been they trained on interviewing talent in a way that is equitable and inclusive? Or are we still asking the same questions that we were asking like 10 years ago or 15 years ago? Are we training our recruiters and interviewers and hiring managers on how to write feedback in a way that is inclusive and equitable? So we are trying to minimize biases as much as possible, right? So again, it's a very long-winded answer. Every single company will need to focus on something different, but the key factor here is making sure that the processes and the practices and the platforms that we use, that they're equitable by design instead of uninclusive or inequitable.
So we need to look at the things which are not just celebratory, but the actual processes, the not so sexy aspects, like making sure that the interview feedback is given better, or blind hiring for that matter. Just make sure that the practices are perfect rather than just the celebratory part of it.
Exactly. And I wouldn't go as far as saying that they're perfect, because at the end of the day, minimizing biases, it takes a very long time. It takes a lot of effort. And of course, every single person, they will have their own biases, right? So what happens is, especially when we create systems or platforms or processes, we embed the biases that we bring and the stereotypes that we have and the way that we work. And when we do that, we embed those biases in the processes and the practices that we follow as well. So I don't think that every single process will be perfect ever. I think that we do need to make them, I do believe in progress over perfection, right? Because what we know today will evolve in just a couple of years, right? So we do need to make sure that, yes, we are minimizing biases as much as we can, but making sure that we are flexible enough to re-review those practices maybe next year as well, and making sure that we're making our processes inclusive for that particular demographic that maybe for whatever reason we were not thinking about like this year, right? So yeah, I think that flexibility is key here as well.
Because of this DE&I becoming popular, the entire there's a generation of people who are right now DE&I professionals, and there's a job title called Chief Diversity Officer. It's a very confusing job title.
It is.
Because people don't last in that particular job for a very long period of time. So could you, because you work with so many of them, could you tell us what's really the job role of a CDO, Chief Diversity Officer?
Yes. I would love to give you one answer, but again, every single company has a different understanding of what D&I is. Every single company has a completely different understanding of what a CDO is. So many companies are still only focused on the diversity piece, on the representation piece, on the hiring piece. So the CDO is basically that. It's a Chief Diversity Officer, someone that is focused on attracting and retaining talent from historically excluded communities. And that is it, which for some companies might work because, again, they might still need to do a little work just to get to the equity and inclusion piece. But that's something that we see very, very often. For some other companies, again, they might be a little bit more advanced on their journey. So the CDO might be a little bit focused on what I was talking about before, on deconstructing every single policy, every single step of the way for the company, and making sure that they are embedding equity, inclusion, and accessibility in the way that the company works as a company, as a core mission, and as a core value. However, I do agree with you that a lot of CDOs, unfortunately, they don't last long on their jobs. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The very first reason behind it is extremely hard, especially if you're focusing on making a company more equitable and inclusive and accessible. As we were talking at the very beginning of our conversation, it is extremely hard to get buy-in from leaders, right? From the CEOs or the CXOs or the business leads or the executives on the company. And whenever that happens, whenever they don't truly understand the value of ED&I, whenever they do not commit, the CDO, they cannot actually do their jobs, right? Because they will probably review again. Let's go back to the hiring piece, right? Like they will review the job description and they will say, hey, you know what? Like we might want to make our job descriptions a little bit more inclusive. Let's remove the college degree aspect so we can eliminate that barrier and we can amplify our pool of candidates. And then the business leads go like, no, no. I don't have a valid reason for it, but this is the way that the company has been hiring talent for decades. We are not going to do that, right? So, and that example is a very tiny, minuscule example, but imagine what that happens if that is the same resistance that CDOs get for every single aspect of their job. You cannot literally do your job. And on top of that, of course, doing ED&I work, it is very emotionally taxing because your CDOs are often, or ED&I professionals in general, they're usually part of a historically excluded community on their own. So they're fighting and they're living their own exclusion on their day-to-day, and they feel it and they live it at work as well. And they also see it on their teams and their counterparts. And they do see and they do notice that sometimes the change that they are making is not enough, or that change is not happening fast enough. So there's a very, very high level of burnout on ED&I professionals, and that usually comes from the inability, basically, to do the job that they were hired for.
There's always a chance that transition is going to take way more time than what you anticipate. You might think that, okay, I'm going 100%. To improve this metric by X% in 3 years, but you don't think it's going to change in 6 years or 7 years. That's often something that happens.
Exactly. And usually, so here's the thing, and here's the thing that I usually try to help business leaders to understand, right? Like, we're operating as a society, we're operating under systems that they're, like racist and uninclusive and inaccessible by design. Like, as a society, obviously, that's going to translate into the company and how the company operates as well. And that's been the way that the system has been working for hundreds of years. So it is impossible to go ahead and change the way that the company operates in just a couple of months. It is gonna take time because, again, we need to review like every single tiny aspect of how the company operates. We can make quick change happen, like, for example, like focusing only on hiring, right? But then we do fall under this performative actions that we were talking about before, right? Because if we only focus on hiring, but we do not focus on how the hiring process operates, or whether this talent that we are trying to hire, if they're going to have an amazing experience at work, of if our onboarding process is inclusive on its own, like, numbers are not going to shift as much as we want them to, because, again, we focus on only like one tiny piece of it without trying to solve the rest of the issue. So this change, it actually takes, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes budget, because again, at the end of the day, what we are doing is we are revamping the way that the company works, like at its core and its mission and its value. And that's not something that will change from one day to the next.
It's a cultural change.
100%. 100%. And that's probably like the toughest thing. And we go back to the part of the conversation where we're talking about making sure that a leader fully understands what D&I is, because you can make culture change at the talent level.
Mm-hmm.
But if the business lead is not fully engaged, is not fully committed, whatever cultural change you're trying to make is gonna get it's gonna get blocked at some point. And whenever that happens, whenever the talent sees it, they're just gonna end up leaving, and all of that effort that you put into hiring those people, it'll just be for nothing at the end of the day.
There's a lot of written material on
Yes.
remove how to remove bias from hiring practices. But
Yeah.
there isn't a lot which is spoken about promotions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you've gotten people inside the company, but in order for a cultural change, you also need to promote them in the right manner. So how does the ED&I initiatives fit into promotion? There's nothing that I have read which satisfies me. Could you help us
Awesome.
with that?
Yeah. So 100%. So there is a reason, I want to say, like, there are a million reasons, but there is one particular reason why we don't see that in writing, or we don't see that conversation happening a lot. And the reason behind it is, again, most companies are purely focused on the hiring piece, as we were talking about before. And we hire the talent. What happens afterwards is not our problem,
Yes.
right? So that's something that's happening. So what we can do as ED&I professionals, and this, of course, again, it'll be different for every single company. It'll take some time, but if you fully commit, it's something that you can get done in just a couple of months. So one of the things that we can do is we can take a look at, yes, of course, the hiring data, like how many people we've hired, and if there's any way for us to understand like the demographics or the different diversity indicators that we may want to take a look at. And then we can take a look at, like, of course, we need to focus on the previous performance review. And if we do have like historical data, that's even greater. But we can take a look at how many, like, who is actually getting promoted in the company and how often. What are the managers that are actually promoting talent? And who are the managers that are not promoting talent? Do we have a difference between departments? Like, is client services promoting more talent than, I don't know, software engineering? And then we need to take a more granular look into the data. Like, are Black employees getting promoted than our Latina employees, or our white employees? Are Black women getting more promotions or enough promotions, or are they not getting promoted compared to Asian women, for instance, right? And then again, we do need to take a look at who the managers were, and then try to assess if there is a correlation, right, between like middle managers, senior managers, and the talent that they're promoting, and how often. And then we can do the same thing with the salary raises, like, who are we giving raises to, and how often, and who are not giving raises to. And then something else that I like to do is taking a look at whomever was not promoted or given a salary raise in 2 years, right? Like, any more than 2 years, we do have a problem that we need to address there. But that actually gives us a few indicators of what's happening behind the scenes. And something else that we can do, and I know that we talked about like inclusive language and job descriptions, but something that is not often talked about is inclusive language and performance reviews. So what I mean by that is whenever managers are writing their performance reviews, there is a lot of data that actually says that, for example, women in general, they're assessed based on their personality and not on their skills. And then whenever we try to break it down a little bit more, we actually see that Black women, for instance, and Latina women, they're not only assessed on their personality as a whole, but the personality traits that are being assessed are actually negative. And those same traits are actually assessed as positive on men, especially in white men, right? So that's what I mean
give
is,
us a
yeah,
better understanding of that? Could you give us with
yeah,
an
yeah, yeah.
example?
So, exactly. So, for example, we can say Mary is very assertive,
Okay.
right? And the rest of the team does not feel comfortable working with Mary because she is very assertive and she's very direct. And whenever we forget about Mary and we say John, for instance, and we say like John is very assertive, it is extremely unlikely that their teammates or their manager is going to give John a negative performance review based on their assertiveness. So that is something that we see a lot in not in job descriptions, but in performance reviews. There are a lot of tools that can actually help with identifying that uninclusive language. And the problem is, if it's one, yes, of course, like even if it's only one performance review is awful, but the problem is when that gets like perpetuated and not called out, right? It is something that one particular manager is doing. So they're going to embed it in the way that they work and the way that they write their performance reviews. So it is extremely likely that they're doing the same thing with every single person that they manage. And then if that's not called out, it's extremely likely that other managers will start doing the same thing. And what happens is that Mary, in this case, will not get promoted. Not that one time, not the following time, because even if she gets a different manager, that new manager probably has access to the previous manager's
Previous
notes.
reports. Yeah.
So all of that information that we are adding in is already biased based on somebody else's biased opinion, right? So there is a lot of different things that we need to tackle here. And this is exactly what I mean when I say that we need to deconstruct and evaluate every single aspect of the way that a company operates, including the way that we communicate, the way that we write, the way that we talk about our colleagues, or the way that we talk about our managers.
There's one particular topic, and it's a very sensitive and a contentious issue.
Mm-hmm.
Ageism.
Yes.
There are people after a certain age, when they apply for a job, they are more likely to face rejections because company is always going to look at the bottom line, the profits.
Yeah.
How do you ensure that you're not discriminating against a person because of their age? Everything aside, just on the age factor. And I think in mainstream media, this conversation is not really spoken about in terms of how do you tackle, do you bring in ageism into the fold of ED&I, or do you keep it separately? What are your thoughts on that?
No, I do it, and absolutely it has to be part of the D&I conversation. And I agree with you. Unfortunately, it's not something that we talk about much as well. And it is interesting that we are talking about this today, because I want to say last week, and I want to say maybe Monday or Tuesday, I can't remember if it was McKinsey, but there was a report out there that actually shows that women are negatively impacted by ageism at every single stage of their career. Like when they're like just getting started, when they're trying to get like to a manager role, or even after 40. And the reason behind it again is like, no, they're too young to be managers, or now they just had a baby, so they cannot do whatever it is that they're doing, or now they're over 40, so they cannot do anything anymore. But it also impacts men, right? So the way to do it again, and I know that we talked about inclusive language in a couple of occasions, but so let me backtrack a little bit. So language actually impacts the way that we see the world and the way that we understand the world, right? So if we are using language that it's ageist on its own, and we are saying that something gets old school, or we are looking for talent that is digitally native, or all of those things, we are already, again, we are embedding our own biases into the way that interviewers or the hiring managers or the HR professional is looking at talent, right? And that impacts in the way that we work, and again, the way that we promote work and promote talent and all of that. So one of the things, there are a couple of things that we can do at every single stage of the talent journey. For recruiting, for instance, again, making sure that the job description is using inclusive language at every single aspect of it, making sure that we are asking our candidates, if it's not explicit, like, we need to make sure that talent understands that we don't need to see their pictures, that we don't necessarily need to see the day that they were that they went to college. Like, I would actually address it at the recruitment and hiring manager aspect first, like making sure that we are addressing their biases first. But it's something that we can do in parallel, especially if we know that our team needs a little bit more training, right? If we know that they're biased against like either too young or too like older generations. So making sure that our talent understands and knows that they don't need to add those details so as not to bias our hiring process. It should be the other way around. But as we figure that stuff out, let's help the talent in making sure that they get their foot in the door. So that's one thing. The other thing, whenever we are interviewing, and this applies for every single demographic, but especially for ages, and making sure that whenever we are asking our questions, that our behavioral questions are as unbiased as possible as well. And the reason behind it is behavioral questions. We were told that behavioral questions are the best way to hire talent inclusively, and they're not wrong. They're not 100% right.
Give me an example of a behavioral question which is biased versus one which is unbiased.
Awesome. And I'll tell you why. So let me tell you why before we get to the example. So past performance does not equal future performance, right? Because again, past experience or past performance is usually based on opportunity, on privilege, and a lot of other things, right? So for example, if I were to ask someone, hey, can you tell me a little bit more about how you manage a $9 million project? That could be a behavioral question. However, it is biased, right? We are assuming that that person had the privilege and the opportunity to work a $9 million project. A way to make it unbiased is, can you tell me a little bit more about how do you manage a large project? And then you can ask questions like what a large project means to you, or what would you do if your budget were like a little bit larger, right? Another example, and the creativity industry, for instance, that they're extremely focused on inspiration, right? So something that I've seen asked a lot is like, hey, tell me about the latest article that you read, I don't know, an ad age that inspired you. And however, ad age is a paid subscription. Not everybody has access to that particular media, right? So a way to make it a little bit more inclusive and unbiased is, hey, tell me a little bit more about like an article or a book that you've read that inspired you to do X, Y, and Z. So that's something that we can take and use for ageism as well, because a lot of the questions that we ask during an interview process, we assume that a person knows, I don't know, how to use Zoom or how to use like Miro or like any of those like virtual platforms. And that is actually valid for all of demographics, really. But we do need to make sure, again, that our process is giving equitable options and making sure that the candidate has access to the tools that we are asking them to have access to.
So I think when I look at it from a 10,000 feet view, I'm seeing that the root cause of all the problems is probably data, whether it's on the diversity side, whether it's on the equity side, or the inclusion side, promotion. And data is the real problem over here, right? Because whenever you speak to a company, they would say, we design our processes and we look forward to getting data. But data is always a bottleneck. How do
Yeah.
you get past this data bottleneck?
Okay. So again, every company will have their own way to like access data and run surveys and all of that. But the one thing that I would say is, first of all, as a company, you do need to ask yourself what do I need the data for, and what am I gonna do with this data?
Mm-hmm.
Like asking our candidates or our existing talent just for their demographics just because is not doing is not doing us any favors, right? Especially if we are working on an international company where we have offices across the globe. Every single country will have their own ways to naming different things and different demographics. And some countries might be completely illegal to ask about a couple of things. And in some countries, some identities are illegal themselves. So we cannot just look at the data as a one size fits all solution. Like, I'm going to give you a very quick example. A couple of years ago, I was collaborating with a company, and they were surprised about how high their Latina employee demographic was. And I was like, okay, they're probably doing a very good job of attracting and hiring Latina talent here in the United States. And that's not what they were doing. Basically, what they were doing is they were adding on the talent from Latin America, like living in Latin America. They were adding those numbers into their US data demographics. And that's not how it works, right? And the reason behind it is, for example, in Latin America, talent does not consider themselves Hispanics or Latinas as we do here in the United States, right? So that's a very, very easy example. So how do we address data? Again, every single company will need to do it their own way based on the offices they have, the languages that every single person speaks. With that in mind, I do recommend, whenever possible, having at least 3 separate data sets, if you may. Okay. One for recruiting, so we can understand, again, the talent that we are hiring, but more specifically, the talent that we are not hiring. So if we were putting a lot of efforts, again, in hiring Latina talent, but we are not hiring them, I want to know what's happening. I want to know why. I want to know what we can do better, right? Is the problem in the sourcing aspect of it? Are we not finding talent, like Latina talent, that's fairly easy to solve? Or is it the problem in the interviews? Like, are interviewers or recruiters or hiring managers biased, again, Latina talent? Or are we making them offers that are lower than we would make to a different demographic, right? So that's one set of data that I want to see. The other set of data that I want to see is the talent that is currently living and breathing in the company. Okay. Yes, of course, I do want to see demographic data because, again, I want to, what we were talking about before, like who's getting promoted, who's not getting promoted, who's the manager, who's promoting, and all of that. But I also want to see data about inclusion, right? Like, I want to learn whether the talent that we have currently feels at home. Okay. Or if there is anything that we can do to make that better. And then the other data that I want to see that a lot of companies are not even paying attention to is exit data. I want to see why our employees are leaving the company. And I want to fully understand why. Was it truly because they got a new opportunity? And if that's the case, good for them. I'm super happy. But is there another issue in there? Was it because we didn't give them the promotions that we were talking about before? Was it about a particular manager? Was it about X, Y, and Z? That's the data that we want to see. And one of the things that I often see happening, especially on the recruiting side, because especially here in the United States, asking certain questions during the recruitment process is illegal. So a lot of companies, what they do is, unfortunately, they resort to making assumptions and, you know, looking at someone's picture and name and assuming that person's ethnicity, race, and all of those things. So one of the things that I usually recommend in that case, because again, it is legal to ask certain questions, is refocus your attention. Like remove your attention from the individual and focus your attention on the sources that you're using to find the talent. So for example, say that you were partnering with, I don't know, an organization that is focused on hiring more talent in the technology space, and you get candidates out of that organization. Again, you're assuming that you can make an informed assumption that that person that you're interviewing is either a woman, identify as a woman, or is a strong ally and advocate for women in technology. And in that case, we're not asking the person, right? Like, what is your gender? But we're taking that information again from the source without like putting all of the information onto the individual.
That's interesting. I think this has been so insightful. I really think we should be talking more. But I think
100%.
we've run out of time. I really enjoyed the part where you told me that the data should be broken into buckets: the recruitment bucket, the retention bucket, and the exit bucket. Right?
Yes.
Could you tell us more about the exit bucket? One is the why. Why has someone left the company? But specifically, are you also tracking the demography data over there?
I would do that 100%. Like, and again, it might really depend on the country limitation or the company limitation. But if you already have that data from like the retention piece, like the talent does the same, right? Like they were working at the company and they decided to leave. So I would 100% use the demographic data as well, because at the end of the day, and it goes like circles back to the beginning of our conversation, like some companies doing all of this performative actions, that is exactly, well, you can see that along the talent journey. But when talent leaves, that is exactly when you can like fully identify if your efforts are being performative or not. Because if you hired 10 Latina women, and then 6 months after 9 of them left your company, there is something wrong in there.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I think this is really interesting. I wish we should talk more. But thank you, Daniela. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to having a much larger conversation with you at some point. So that's it, friends. That's it from me and from Daniela. I hope this conversation was as interesting as it was for me. Thank you and have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye.